Imagine a world, now, just stick with me here. Imagine a world where the folks at Articulate took Storyline, turned it into Rise, but still tried to call it Storyline. You'd be like, what the f***? Well, that's pretty much what Adobe just did with the all-new version of Captivate. It's interesting. Stick around. Hey there folks, Tim Slade here from the eLearning Designers Academy. You know, as many of you know, I have always been a very dedicated, evangelical, almost dogmatic user of Articulate Storyline since it first came out way back in 2012. And you know, even before that, I was an avid Articulate user back when the only product that they offered was Articulate Studio, which was really just a fancy PowerPoint plugin. And, you know, I'll be the first to admit that I've just never been a big fan of Adobe Captivate. I mean, you know, the handful of times that I've had to use it, it's just never been a really enjoyable experience. And, you know, unless you're somebody out there who's been using Captivate for years and years and years, and it's the only tool you've had access to, you know, more power to you. Those people exist. But for everyone else, it's always been known for being harder to learn, clunky to use, and just having a really, gosh, I don't know, an outdated experience, look and feel, the workflows. It's just never been great. But you know what? I think there was a glimmer of hope when the folks at Adobe back in 2021 announced that they were working on a brand new version of Captivate, which they called Project Charm. Now, I won't lie, I didn't pay much attention to this news or any of the scuttlebutt when Project Charm was first announced. You know, from the little that I saw of it, and at the time, you know, honestly, I just thought, gosh, this looks like more of the same thing. And so, you know, I'll be honest, I really didn't care. But if we fast forward to now, June of 2023, the folks at Adobe finally, out of the blue, decided to drop the all-new version of Adobe Captivate. And again, I'm going to be really honest here. When I first saw the news this past week, I thought, cool, it's finally here. They finally did it. I'm going to get back to my Articulate Storyline work. And, you know, the truth is, I wasn't planning on making this video. But, you know, it wasn't until I started looking at some of the demo videos of it did I realize, oh, this is not at all what I thought it was going to be. And this is where things get super interesting. So with that being said, let's take a look at the all-new Adobe Captivate. So here I am, and I've just installed Adobe Captivate, and I've launched it. And here's our start screen of the all-new version of Adobe Captivate. And you can see we have a couple different options here to create a new project or do a simulation, like a screen recording simulation. Now I'm gonna go ahead and click here to go into creating a new project. And as it loads here, you know, this looks very similar to the old version of Captivate in the sense that we have our slide area here in the middle, and it's kind of similar to what you might expect in Articulate Storyline. Now, you know, the interesting thing about Adobe Captivate is that we still have slides, but as you'll see here in a little bit, I don't think slides is the right term for it. It's more like screens, right? But the foundation is that we have different slides, and we can see our different slides over here on the left where we can add different types of content and add different blocks. You can see here we have the option to add text blocks and multimedia blocks, and there's some interactive components. We'll explore those here in a moment. Over here on the right-hand side, we have our properties panel. We'll take a look at that. And of course, just like before, and just like Articulate Storyline, we have our timeline, right? Now, that all feels super familiar, but where things start getting different in this new version of Adobe Captivate is once we start adding content and editing content and adding stuff. And this is where the authoring really takes a turn from what you might have expected in old versions of Adobe Captivate or what you would expect in Articulate Storyline. So let's say, hypothetically, I wanted to create a title slide for a course, right? Now, of course, I can come in here and check out some of these text blocks or add a multimedia block where there's characters and images with text. Instead, I'm going to add a new slide. So if I click the plus button here, this is where we can add a new slide. And you can see there's different slide types. We have blank slides, which is what we have here. I'll come back to that in a moment. We have an introduction slide, text and image, meet the team, et cetera, and then we have our quiz slides down there at the bottom. So I'm going to create an introduction slide for a title slide. So I'll go ahead and click introduction here. It's going to add a new slide, and we get this template here, right? And I'm going to delete this blank slide that we have here. I don't need that, right? So that all seems pretty intuitive. Now, as we look at this slide here, it's put in a placeholder image, and we have our course name and author name, and then we have different layout options we can choose from. And, I imagine that if I were to replace some of these images and change some of the colors, I could really customize this to make it look really nice. Not all of these templates are as beautiful as maybe what I would want to create for myself, but that's just me, right? So here, here's a great little slide template, right? So I can click here and type in a course name. We'll say, our company values, at, what's this company? I have no idea. Cyberco, right? Maybe that's what I want to have for my title slide. And for this image here, I can click on this, and there's options here in our properties panel to change the look and feel of the image, and I can blur it and change the brightness and do all of those things. And of course, if I want to change the image, I can just click here on this button, and I have options to get an image from an asset library where I can choose from different stock photos, or I can upload my own image from my computer, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'll search something from the assets, and we're going to search, office. Let's see what comes up. We can see all sorts of fun images here. I'll click this one, replace image, and it puts it in there here in just a second, right? There we go. Okay, cool. Now, at this point in the design process or the authoring process, this is where you're going to start discovering how template-based the new version of Adobe Captivate is. As we look at this layout, and even as I have this image selected here, right? When you have an object selected in PowerPoint or Articulate Storyline or in the older versions of Adobe Captivate, you see these handles around objects, right? And what do those handles usually indicate in different authoring tools or softwares? That you can resize them, right? But you'll notice as I click on it, it's like dragging everything as if it's a group, which is a little odd. And then you might want to click and drag it, and you can't do it, right? And this is where the new version of Adobe Captivate is very focused on being templated based. And the reason why, as we will see here in a moment, it's all to help control the responsive nature of it. And what do I mean by that? Well, the major selling point of the new version of Adobe Captivate is that it's responsive. And that means that whether you're looking at it on a tablet or a phone, your content's automatically going to reflow and respond, just like it does in Rise 360, if you're familiar with it, right? You don't have to think about how it's going to look on a mobile device. It just works. Well, that same concept applies here in Adobe Captivate as well. So you'll notice up here at the top, I have a couple different options. Right now I'm viewing it, what it'll look like on a desktop, but if I click here, it's going to reflow and adjust for a tablet or reflow and adjust for a phone. And this is the power and also the limitation of the new version of Adobe Captivate, because it's putting these guardrails around my ability to customize these slides. I'm stuck with this template. And just to best illustrate what I mean by that, if I were working in Articulate Storyline, and let's say I wanted to add a logo up here in this corner of the screen, I would just go insert a picture and add my logo. Here in Adobe Captivate, I can't do that. I can't insert a shape. I can't insert additional text boxes here. I can't add a logo. It's all locked into this template to help control the responsiveness, to keep the responsiveness working. In the older versions of Captivate, it was responsive, but you had these things called breakpoints. And essentially you had to design 3 different versions of your course in order to make it responsive. And they've gotten rid of that, and they're doing it for you. But, the cost of that is, this templated structure and layout. Now, does that mean that you can't, customize the look and feel of all of this? No. As we look at the options here in the properties panel, I can turn on and off different items, right? So if I don't want this card look, I can turn that off, or I can turn it on. I can adjust a little bit with the spacing of different items. You can do some things, but it's all going to be kind of locked in, right? I can turn on and off the image, and I can turn on and off that caption or the subtitle, or I can make it look like that card look again. I can add a button. But, again, if I don't want that button there, let's say I want it up over here, you can't do it. It's locked into place, right? You can adjust it, adjust the look and feel, but the layout of it is more fixed than what you would have had in the older versions of Adobe Captivate, right? Okay, so that's basic slide. Let's go ahead and add another slide, and then we can start getting into this new infinite scroll feature of Adobe Captivate, right? So let's say I want to add another slide, and we're going to add a meet the team type of slide, and I'm going to insert that, and it's going to automatically create the slide. Again, we have some really nice placeholder images. Maybe I want to change this to get to know our team, right? And if I select this text again, I have different options. I can choose different heading styles, make it bigger, make it smaller. I can change the font. I have all of those options. But again, when it comes to placement, if I wanted to reorganize all of these items, can't do it. You're locked into place. Similar to how things are in Rise, right? It's locked into place. That's the power of it, but it's also the drawback, right? All right, so with these images, let's say I wanted to replace it. I'll do a system image. I downloaded some images, and I'm just going to choose this image here that I downloaded from undraw.co, one of my favorite free asset websites, and it replaces the image, right? And I can do the same thing over here, and we will choose a system image, and I'll do the same thing here, and system image over here, right? All right, so, we've customized that, right? And again, I can edit all of this text and all of that stuff, right? Now, you look at this image here, and you can see it kind of cropped off a little bit of the image because it's cropped to a circle and it's moved it around. So what do we have in terms of image editing, right? And I showed you some of the image filters. We can blur things. I can do contrast, all of that stuff. But if I want to crop it, I think I just have to double click on it, right? Now, this is what I find weird. If I want to crop the image, it opens it up in this new window where I can't really see how it's cropping on the slide itself, which I think is how it was in the older versions of Adobe Captivate, which is very odd. So let's say I wanted to, get more of him in there or the person in the screen. I could crop it over here, and you're going to see how it kind of shows the preview of it. It's not horribly intuitive right now because I'm not seeing how it's going to be represented on the screen. So I have to hit save. Did it do what I wanted? Yeah, okay, that's better. I'm okay with it, right? So that's interesting. Now, I've showed you how to create a couple different slides. We've talked about how they're very locked into place, templated based, but this is where we can start adding additional blocks. So if you think of Rise 360, when you create a lesson, and we don't even call it a slide in Rise, when you create a lesson, you can add these different blocks, and you can start building this like scrollable web page of all of these different interactions and multimedia and text. Well, that same thing happens here in Adobe Captivate. So if I come over here, you can see I can start inserting different types of blocks. So we have a text block, we can add image, multimedia blocks, we can add some interactive blocks, and then we can add these widgets, and I'll show that here in a moment. So let's say we wanted to add a text block, a text in a paragraph. We're gonna add that, and it's gonna put it below that, the Get to Know Team template that I inserted. And let's say I wanted to add some more. Let's do, we want to do a list. Hey, there's a list. Let's add, an image with some text. Maybe we'll do a character and some text. There's that. It defaults to a scenario template. I'm not sure why, but that's okay. I can change that. Maybe we want to add a quote. And then maybe we want to add a video, right? You can start creating these different stacks of blocks where you can add content to it. Now, this is where we start getting into that infinite scroll and the responsive nature of it, right? So before I actually preview what I've built here, if I click on these different icons, I can see how it's going to reflow everything to fit on different devices, right? So I can see how it looks like on a phone, so forth and so on, and I can, edit these things as needed if I need to adjust it, which is quite interesting, right? Now, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, that's cool. How do we start rearranging blocks? This is one area where I wish it was a little bit more intuitive in terms of the authoring workflows, right? So let's say I wanted to put this scenario above this text blocks here, right? Now, if you think of Rise does a really good job of making it super intuitive to rearrange blocks or even add blocks. You get a little like a little interactive thing below each block or the little arrows to allow you to adjust it. And here in the new version of Adobe Captivate, I discovered this by accident. If I click on something, you can click and drag and you can start rearranging, but there's no real clear indication if I'm rearranging it, right? Oh, and see, I moved things around. But it can be a little clunky. I wish it was a little bit more intuitive in that sense to move different stuff around on the screen. Okay, now We've added some content to our, slide. That's what they call it in Captivate. It doesn't feel like a slide to me. It feels more like a screen, but we'll call it a slide because up here, that's what they call it, is a slide. Now let's get into the use of the timeline and maybe some animations. And this is, again, another area that I find interesting, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly the instances in when I might use this, because as you'll see in a little bit, this is where we get a little bit, confusing for me in terms of the user experience we might create. Let me show you what I mean. So let's say I wanted to add some animations to these three objects, right? I can click on an object, and you'll notice if I come over here to my properties panel, we have different options for interactions, and then we have animations. It's this little lightning bolt icon. And we have different animations we can add. So let's say I want to make it scale in. I'll get a little preview of it, and you'll see down here in the timeline, it adds a new item in the timeline to scale in, right? And maybe we want to do the same thing over here. We want that to scale in, and we want this one to scale in. Okay, that's pretty cool. Now, in terms of adjusting when this happens, this is where it gets a little confusing. Again, I'm an articulate storyline user, so adjusting when something animates in would be a matter of selecting the item, adjusting the entrance time on the timeline, and having it scale in. But you'll notice that I can adjust the animation separately from the object itself. And this is where it gets a little funky. So let's say, for example, I'm going to click back on this first item to find that in the timeline. Here it is. Let's say I want to have this, animate in at a half a second. I'll do that. And then we'll do this item, and we'll have that animate in at 1 second. Okay, and then we'll have this one animate in over here at 1.5 seconds, right? And maybe I'll have this go up here so it animates in with that. We'll see. Oops, okay. It's being a little funky. That's okay. Great. Okay, so that's what it's going to look like. So now let's get into previewing it. Let's see what happens when I preview. This is another interesting thing with the new version of Captivate. If I click the preview button up here, it's going to generate a preview. And it's actually going to open up the preview in my browser, so I can actually see what this is going to look like in an actual browser. So if I click the play button here, okay. Now, this is where I think there's still some glitches that the folks at Adobe need to adjust or address. You notice those didn't scale in. They just appeared. So the animations, I think, are a little bit, clunky. But, okay. Besides that, this is where we start seeing things that are super interesting. That's very different from the older versions of Adobe Captivate, very different from Storyline, but very similar to Adobe Rise, right? We have this scrolling nature where we can scroll through these different things. We have a video, all of that good stuff, right? And we can see how it's going to look on different device sizes and all of that stuff, right? And we can, rotate that phone, whatnot, or we can make it full screen just like that. So we get a good way to preview it. And then down here we have our player controls. It's kind of like the Playbar. We can see a menu, and I can go to the different slides that I've created here, and so forth and so on, right? And then here's our Meet the Team. Oh, and then, okay, that animation seemed to work this time, but those two didn't. Why? I have no idea, right? This is where things are a little bit clunkier in Adobe Captivate. So let's go do something else here. I'm going to replace this video down here. I want to actually add an animation to maybe this character, and then I want to add a real video to this video block here. So let's do this. Let's add an animation to this character. And what we're going to do in this instance is I'm going to add an animation to make this character rotate in. Would I do that in real life? Probably not. But I think it rotated in. Maybe we'll do roll in, right? And you can see we have emphasis and exit animations as well. So I've added that animation. Now let's go down here and replace this video with a real video that I have. We're going to do one from the system. You can embed videos or do one from the assets that they offer. We're going to do a system video. And I have a video here from a project I've worked on in the past. So we're going to throw that in there. And it puts the video on the screen. Now, this is where I'm not exactly sure about the user experience that the folks at Adobe are trying to get us as developers to create. So let me show you some of the issues that I see here with what I just did, adding that animation and adding that video. Now, if I preview this, get to know our team slide, and I hit play here.
When a customer says,
"We don't need that right now,"
is that likely the true objection?
And pause. It's playing the video, but am I looking at that video? No. If I scroll down, where's that animation? Well, she already animated in when the slide loaded. This video down here started playing when the slide loaded. And this is one thing that is really different from Rise, and I'm not 100% certain, like I said a moment ago, what the folks at Adobe Captivate are intending from a user or learner experience standpoint. You know, with Rise, if you were to build something very similar in Rise, this animation wouldn't happen until the user got to that point of the page, right? Not the slide, the page. Same thing with the video. This video wouldn't start playing until I got to that point where I could play the video because it's a separate piece of multimedia from all of this. So if you were to build this stacking series of blocks, it's going to play all sorts of, you might have multiple videos here and you don't have independent controls over each of those items. So if I come down to play now.
As you have likely heard before, the first objection is often a knee-jerk response, so it's almost never the true objection. It is merely a way to delay the conversation to some other time. In many cases...
Okay, I'm gonna pause that, right? There wasn't a lot going in that video, but you could definitely hear it. Now, the other thing too that I find odd is I've played around with these player controls. There is no seek bar. I can play, I can pause, but I can't scrub through it. So if I have this video here, and because there's no independent video controls, I can't scrub through the video to get to a certain piece or a part. And here presents another issue that I'm not exactly sure makes a whole lot of sense. Let's say that whole video plays and I want to replay this thing because maybe I was for some reason looking up here while that video way down there was playing. Again, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but you know, that's what they've designed for. How can I replay that video once the slide is done? Well, right now, you know, there's no replay button like you might have in Storyline. To replay that video, I have to go back to a different slide and then proceed forward to reset the slide.
When a customer says,
"We don't need that right now,"
is that likely the true objection?
I'm not sure I'm into that. That, I think, is something that the folks at Adobe definitely need to address in some capacity, right? All right, so let me close out of this. Now, the final thing I want to say, I'm going to close this timeline. Again, I'm not sure exactly, because you're not creating animations similar to what you could do in Storyline, where you can have things animate in and out and move in sync with audio narration, but because you're able to look at the whole slide, you know, the use of the animations is a little odd, right? I added this animation for this character, but we can never see it because it happens when the slide starts. I never see it. In my instinct is it should be happening when the user gets to that point on the page. But, you know, like I've said before, who knows what people will create with this? Maybe there's a different intention. We will see. But on the surface, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. The other thing, too, that isn't very intuitive is resizing these blocks. So one of the things that I discovered by accident is, let's say I want to add some additional spacing between these bullet points, this testimonial, and this video, right? You can resize them here in the middle, but again, there's nothing, you know, drawing my attention to it to do this sort of resizing. Is it nice? Yeah, because I can add some breathing room between these different elements. But, you know, right off the bat, you know, it would be nice to see some sort of handle here where I can not only resize it, but maybe I want to add a block between these two, right? There should be a little plus icon or something for me to do that sort of thing. So I like the idea of the infinite scroll, but like I said, it's a little funky in its execution, especially when you start thinking about different forms of multimedia. Okay, let's add another slide. I'm going to add a slide. Let's talk about interactivity. Let's do a blank slide. And on this blank slide, maybe I'm going to add a widget. These widgets are pre-built interactions. Think of them as like what you might have in Rise, or if you go back to the old versions of Articulate Studio, you had Articulate Engage interactions, right? Where you have timelines and clicked reveals and tabs and hotspots and all of that stuff, which is nice to have because you can build some quick interactions, click to reveal interactions without having to do a lot of work. So we'll do a timeline widget, and it's going to load it, and it's going to throw it here on our screen. And of course, we have different design options we can choose from. And I will say, as I'm clicking through these different design options, the responsiveness of it's a little slower than I would like, and I'm using a pretty powerful Mac here. And I should pause. I'm going to give Adobe some credit here, credit that, they've deserved for a long time. You'll notice I'm running this on a Mac. I'm not having to go, hey, where do I install Parallels? And, then install Windows to run, that other authoring tool that I love so much. It just runs on a Mac. So I'm going to give like 10 points to the folks at Adobe for doing that. The ball is in your court on that, articulate people. Okay. So just like with everything else, there's all these different items. I can replace these images. I can replace this text. If I click on the slide, I can turn off the title, all of that is pretty clear. I can change the background. Let's say I want to make the background, I don't know, that color. I can do that. It includes a previous and next button, which I find interesting because again, if I'm doing that, stacked block thing, right? If I add a text paragraph and then I start adding, the character thing again, having that previous next button up here is a little odd, but I guess I could figure out how to move it down or add that in there instead of it being here on the screen, which is interesting, right? And again, if we preview this, take a moment to preview and hit play. We have a little simple click to reveal interaction for a timeline, right? Now, as we're speaking of interactivity, pre-built interactivity and custom interactivity, unlike Storyline, can you add your own slide layers and do your own custom click to reveals like that? Not really. You can do some custom interactivity from what I've gathered using triggers, or I think they call them actions here in Adobe Captivate. But again, I find myself a little bit perplexed between the fixed layout of things and where custom interactivity fits into this. But again, it's one of those things that as more people play with it, I think it'll become more and more clear. So for example, if I go back to my slide, my first slide here, and we have our button here, if I click on this button, and I go all the way over here to our interactions panel, this is where I can start adding actions to tell Captivate what I want that button to do. And it's similar to creating triggers in Storyline. So let's say I want it to go to the next slide. I can just click go to next slide. That's the action. What slide is it going to go to? Slide 02. And I can add a slide transition. The slide transitions are here in the triggers panel. That's a little odd, so I can maybe make it slide left. It'll preview it, and I can click done, and I've created a trigger, and I can continue adding triggers to that as well. Now, if I go back to editing this trigger, or action, or interaction, as I call it, this is also where I can add conditions to it, and I can do, all sorts of different actions here as well beyond, just making it go to the next screen. I can make it jump to different slides. And you can do some, I guess, branching interactivity. I haven't gotten to that point yet, so that'll be interesting. So again, if we preview this, click our play button here, and click the button, it does what I told it to do.
When a customer
right?
says,
We don't need that right now.
And then there's that video that's playing that we can't see because it's way down here, right? Okay, now I'm just being petty about it, but it doesn't make sense if you're asking me. All right, so we talked about creating slides. We talked about some interactivity, animations, the blocks. From there, let's talk about different types of quizzing that you can add. If I come in here, add another slide, there are different question slides that we can add. So like a multiple choice question. It's going to take a moment to load and put it in there. It put it here for some reason, but I imagine I can easily readjust it. And this is one thing I'll say here. You see how as I'm moving this slide around, I get that little blue bar to indicate where I want it to be? That same sort of visual indicator should be present when I'm adding. That should have gone down here where I told it to. Oh, because my result slide's there. When I'm moving around blocks, but it's not, right? So, here I can add a question, what color is the sky, and I can add my different options, and maybe I make that the correct option. Let's see how I do that. Maybe that's over here. Boop, 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 boop. Multiple answers, attempts, answer, select an answer. Okay, done. And we've created a simple quiz question, right? And let's preview that, see what that looks like. Play. Boop. And then we get some feedback here, right? Okay, pretty simple. The final thing I'll look at is accessibility, right? So, accessibility is becoming such an important thing in the authoring tool market. The folks at Articulate have worked really hard on accessibility or improving the accessibility features of Rise and Articulate Storyline. And I think here in the new version of Adobe Captivate, the folks at Adobe have done a really good job making adjusting accessibility super simple and intuitive. So if I find the accessibility options, we'll find that right here in our properties panel. This is where we can do simple things like adjusting the slide accessibility, adding accessible text. We can show the tab order. We can adjust the tab order. We can have things hide from the screen reader. All of that's pretty easy peasy. If I click on an image and we can add some text here for alt text for the image, I think that's pretty intuitive. I think they've done a really good job with that as well. And of course, if I go down to our video here, let's close out of this and come up here. We can add captions to it. Pretty good. All right. Now, the final thing I'll show down here in this button, we have our assets screen. And this is another great thing that, this is an opportunity where I think the folks at Adobe can show a lot of different options available to folks when it comes to using these different blocks to create different types of slides and interactions. So there's all sorts of different characters you can choose from with different styles. There's different images you can choose from, different icons you can insert. There's audio, and I think there was some video down there as well. And so as we look at the different slide templates here, if I click View All, we get a whole bunch of different templates we can insert. And so let's say, for example, I wanted to add, I think that's a tabbed interaction. We'll insert that. And I believe it'll insert it as a new slide, but we will find out here in a moment. All right, so here is that tabbed interaction, and we have these different tabs or buttons that the learner can click on to reveal different types of content. But again, we're stuck with this template, this fixed layout. So, we can obviously edit the content in each tab, but we can't move tabs around or anything like that, right? So you can see how that looks in a mobile version. All right, now the final thing I'll show down here, we have our options for the table of contents and Playbar. We have some simple options here for whether or not we want to show essentially our menu. We can adjust all of those items, rename it, very similar to adjusting and customizing the menu in Storyline if you're familiar. And then of course we have the Playbar here where we can adjust what options are available, closed captioning, the table of contents, previous next button, et cetera, et cetera. Again, no seek bar. I think that's a little bit of a miss. And then down here in this bottom corner, we have our project properties where we can adjust the theme and the colors, I imagine the fonts and all of that great stuff. All right, so that's the all new version of Adobe Captivate. Let's now debrief, analyze, and break down everything that we just looked at. Now, I got to say, from the standpoint of being a die-hard Articulate Storyline and Rise user, while this new version is certainly much more intuitive than the older versions of Adobe Captivate, I'm going to be honest, it still felt clunky. And, of course, that might be my own learning curve with this being a new tool, and maybe that's something that the folks at Adobe are going to be fine-tuning over time. I think I expected a little bit more in terms of refinement. But along those lines, I think it would be in their benefit to publish some sort of public roadmap so that we, as users, can better see their vision for how they plan on building upon this new tool in the future. At least I hope so. Now, however, as I reflect on my experience playing around with it, the bigger question that keeps popping into my mind is how will the different user groups within the market perceive this new version of Captivate? And you know what? As I view it, I see three main groups of people that we need to consider. First, existing Captivate users. Second, Rise 360 users. And third, folks like me, existing Storyline users. So let's start with those well-established, die-hard Captivate users. Now, I don't want to speak for that whole population of folks. I'll let them speak for themselves. But, if I were to make some educated guesses based purely on my experience using this new version of Captivate, I suspect they're going to feel a little restrained by the fact that this new version of Captivate is so focused on being templated based. And because of that, I fear that they're going to view this as a step backwards, as Adobe is clearly trying to appeal even harder to that rapid authoring no coding, keep it super, super, super simple group of users. And I mean, for context, for those of you who aren't familiar with the previous versions of Captivate, it was much more closer to being like Storyline in terms of custom authoring, whereas this new version has shifted and it's much more like Rise. Now, the truth is, it's really no different than how many Storyline users, including myself, viewed Rise when it first came out as a much more limited authoring tool. However, I think the folks at Articulate were savvy enough to make Rise its own standalone tool rather than trying to transform Storyline into Rise or Rise into Storyline. But, with that being said, I'll be super curious to see what types of learning experiences folks create with this new version of Captivate as they dig into it. But I will go as far as saying that, this is a very different tool. And I could even make the argument that Adobe shouldn't have called this Captivate because it feels like such a different tool than the older versions of Captivate. Now, speaking of Rise, for those folks out there who are currently using Rise 360 as their primary authoring tool, first off, if anything, I think they're going to be attracted to the price point that Adobe Captivate offers. With Rise, you're paying nearly $1,400 a year, whereas with the new version of Captivate, you can get it for as little as $34 a month, which is nothing. However, with the annual Articulate subscription, while it's far more expensive, you're also getting access to Articulate Storyline in addition to Rise, and of course, the whole suite of Articulate 360 tools and assets and services. Now, beyond pricing, I think the people who use Rise might enjoy some of the added design customization options available in this new version of Adobe Captivate, along with the fact that instead of having all of your files in the cloud on Articulate's servers, which is how Rise currently operates, with Captivate, it's a desktop application. And so that means you have complete control over your project files, which a lot of people complain about with Rise. However, I think the Rise folks will get easily frustrated with why things aren't as easy, intuitive, and as simple as they are in Rise. The thing about Rise is that, yes, although it can be limiting in terms of design options, you can practically use Rise with your eyes closed and not worry about screwing anything up. And I'll be honest, after playing around with this new version of Captivate, there were a few moments where I felt like I was practically going to launch a nuclear missile into North Korea if I did the wrong thing. I know that's an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. All right, so after the existing Captivate folks and after the Rise 360 crowd, that leaves folks like me, the die-hard Storyline users. And, the question I want to ask and answer is, do I think this new version of Adobe Captivate is going to pull away any folks like me and others who have grown to love and depend and use Storyline on a regular basis? And the answer is no, not really. At least not right now, and definitely not for me right now. Do I wish Articulate was more flexible and affordable in their pricing? Yeah. Do I wish I could run Storyline natively on a Mac? You have no idea. But, with that said, I'll say the same thing I would have told you with the older versions of Adobe Captivate. Captivate might be the tool I have to use, depending on the project or the client that I'm working with. But Storyline is always going to be the tool I want to use. And that's how I feel about this new version of Adobe Captivate. All right, so that's my overview and thoughts and current impressions about the all-new Adobe Captivate. And, remember, these are just my opinions. You certainly don't have to agree with me, and I certainly don't speak for the whole industry. And you should definitely go check it out for yourself and download the free trial so that you can make your own informed opinion. So, with that in mind, I want to know what you think. Have you had a chance to download and play with the new version of Adobe Captivate? What do you think? What do you like? What don't you like? What were you expecting? What has surprised you? Share your thoughts by commenting down below. Otherwise, I want to thank you so much for watching. If you haven't done so already, make sure to click that like, subscribe, and that bell button to get alerted the next time I publish a video just like this one. And of course, make sure to check out the link down in the comments to join us inside the eLearning Designers Academy, where we focus on building our e-learning and instructional design careers by focusing on skills first. Otherwise, my name is Tim Slade, and until next time, I'll see you around.